Today we're out here in the forest with one of the automotive unicorns in America, the 2019 Hyundai Nexo hydrogen fuel cell crossover. This is one of only 3 vehicles powered by hydrogen available in America, one of only 2 that you can purchase rather than lease, and the only hydrogen crossover in our country. In this video, we'll be talking not just about the 2019 Nexo and how it compares to other crossovers available in America like Hyundai's own Santa Fe, but also how this compares to the rest of the hydrogen fuel cell lineup and to some of the EVs available in this country as well. We'll be talking about which one might be right for you, whether you're looking at a longer range EV or a longer range fuel cell vehicle, and of course, just about hydrogen fuel cell technology generally. The Nexo is the second generation of Hyundai's fuel cell crossover, but for this generation, they decided to separate it from their regular gasoline model, so it no longer shares a name with those other vehicles, and it really doesn't share many parts either. Hyundai's first generation fuel cell crossover looked exactly like its gasoline counterpart, only it was powered by a fuel cell. For the Nexo, they've decided to go in a different direction, and this is actually a unique vehicle. It doesn't really share much with the Santa Fe or with the Tucson. The front end is still distinctively a Hyundai vehicle, but you can also see that the overall design has definitely been changed. The headlights are divorced from these daytime running lights and the turn signals that you can see flashing over there on that side, just as we see in the Santa Fe, but the grille is different and the overall front end design is different as well. Since we're in the top end trim, we do have parking sensors up front. At 183.9 inches long, the Nexo slots right between the Tucson and the Santa Fe. This is about 7 inches longer than a Tucson, 5 inches shorter than a Santa Fe. But on the inside, it is actually a little bit more Santa Fe than Tucson in terms of overall interior legroom. That's because the Nexo has shorter overhangs up front and out back. Now, interestingly enough, Hyundai did not take a Santa Fe and create the Nexo because this actually has a longer wheelbase than the Santa Fe, and that does help out the overall packaging of the hydrogen system and, of course, legroom on the inside. Versus something like a Honda Clarity fuel cell, this is about 10 inches shorter overall, but we have more interior room because of the overall crossover styling. This is about the same length as a Jaguar I-Pace electric vehicle. Obviously, the advantage to the overall dimensions of the Santa Fe are interior room and the more comfortable seating position that we find in a crossover vehicle, but the overall efficiency ends up being a little bit below the Clarity because this is a little bit higher off the ground, and then we just have more frontal area than a sedan. The overall styling out back is also different than the rest of the Hyundai lineup, but still recognizable as a Hyundai crossover. We have LED tail lamps, and then we have LED turn signals right there in the middle. They are red, which is not my preference. Parking sensors down there on the top end trim as well. And again, you'll notice that we really don't have much of an overhang out back. That's, again, what separates this from something like the Santa Fe. The overall packaging efficiency is actually a little bit higher in the Nexo. Things are a little bit complicated under the hood, so let's get the numbers out of the way first, and then we'll talk about how it all works. The fuel cell stack is good for 95 kilowatts of energy production, 127 horsepower approximately. The battery can dissipate 40 kilowatts or about 50 horsepower on its own. That battery pack is located back there in the rear of the vehicle in the cargo area. It's essentially the same lithium-ion battery pack that we find in the Ioniq hybrid, not the Ioniq plug-in hybrid. Then under this hood, also, in addition to the fuel cell stack, we have the electric motor. It produces 161 horsepower and 291 pound-feet of torque. This appears to be the same motor that we find in the Kona electric, although we don't have official confirmation from Hyundai on that. You'll notice that maximum power output from the fuel cell stack and from the battery exceeds the 161 horsepower the motor is capable of. Likely the reason is that the air conditioning system and all the other electronics in the vehicle are consuming the rest. The best way to think of a fuel cell car is as an electric vehicle that has a different kind of battery. The fuel cell is simply producing electricity. It is not moving the car forward. That's what the electric motor is for. And the battery pack in the rear helps act as a ballast for the fuel cell. We need that battery acting as a ballast because fuel cells don't ramp power production as quickly as drivers would like. So to go from 10% power output on the fuel cell stack to 100% power output would take a little bit too long. So in the in-between, they pull power from the battery to help augment things. And likewise, when the fuel cell stack needs to go from 100% power output back to 10% power output, when you lift your foot off the accelerator pedal, it is still producing power. So instead of wasting that power, they send it back to the battery to be used later. That also gives the fuel cell vehicles like this the ability to do regenerative braking. But it is worth noting that with a total capacity of 1.56 kilowatt hours, this is not a very big battery pack. So the regen braking ability is about the same as the average hybrid vehicle out there, not a plug-in hybrid vehicle or an EV. So if you're going down a mountain pass of perhaps 1,000 feet or so, you will completely fill the battery in this. Now let's talk about how it all works. Fuel cells do not burn hydrogen. They depend on catalyst reactions. Hydrogen enters the fuel cell stack on one side, where a catalyst reaction strips electrons off and then passes it down an electrical conductor. The hydrogen protons then pass through a membrane where they are met by oxygen and then the electricity completing the electrical circuit in the vehicle. That's what allows the reaction to convert hydrogen and oxygen into H2O. And then bang, we have water, only there's no bang because it's not burning. The hydrogen in this reaction comes from high-pressure fuel tanks that are under the vehicle. The oxygen just comes from the air around us, and it's forced into the fuel cell stack with a blower. So the one noise you will hear in fuel cell vehicles is sort of like a hairdryer noise coming from underneath the hood. Now let's talk about some of the pros and cons of hydrogen fuel cell technology. These apply not just to the Nexo, but also to the Mirai, the Clarity, and other fuel cell vehicles coming later. The first thing to know is that when you look at overall efficiency from a 30,000-foot view, sort of cradle to grave or well to wheel, whatever you want to call it, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are definitely less efficient than battery electric vehicles. Overall efficiency could be as low as 30% when you take a look at the energy required to get the hydrogen in the first place and then how far it actually got you on that tank of hydrogen. There are a few reasons for that. First off, if you're getting your hydrogen from cracking water and you're using electrolysis to break the hydrogen and the oxygen apart, that takes considerably more energy than you will actually get out of it when you put it back into the fuel cell and then catalyze it to drive the vehicle forward. The other important thing to remember in this process is that at the moment, not all hydrogen is sourced in a quote-unquote green manner. Right now, a large portion of natural gas that you'll find in hydrogen stations comes from natural gas steam reformation. They use a steam reformation process, they pull the hydrogen out, and then they take the rest of the natural gas and either do something with it or they release it into the air. The other source is from oil refining, because in the oil refining process, it does give off free hydrogen, and they can collect that hydrogen and then use it to power these vehicles. Now, with oil refining, you could look at this as using a waste product that would be just released and not used anyway, and therefore, is that green or is it not green? But the original source of that hydrogen did come from petrochemical refining. Obviously, there is some electrolysis going on. Some of those sources out there will use that. So that is a relatively green source, assuming that the power came from wind or solar, etc. And then the future technology that everybody is hoping will come to effect is biogeneration. There are some algae strains that in the right environment can actually produce hydrogen on their own with just solar energy coming into that algae farm. That seems to be the most promising method of creating green hydrogen, but at the moment, none of the hydrogen you'll find out there happens that way. With that out of the way, let's move on to cost of operation. A kilogram of hydrogen at the moment costs on average about $14 in California right now. In terms of cost of operation, that puts this about twice as expensive as driving a Hyundai Santa Fe 2.0T with $3 a gallon gasoline. To help offset that, Hyundai, just like Honda and Toyota with their fuel cell vehicles, gives you a gas card with $13,000 on it to power your hydrogen vehicle. That should be enough hydrogen to drive the Nexo about 51,000 miles. So even though hydrogen is more expensive than other forms of filling, the overall picture could actually be less expensive if you're thinking of leasing a green vehicle on one of these than many of those battery electric vehicles out there. The next important thing to know is that there are a limited number of stations in the United States right now. Almost all of them are in California, although there is one on Hawaii. And at the moment, the Nexo can only be purchased in California, just like the Honda Clarity. At the moment, the Mirai is the only hydrogen vehicle for Hawaii. The California Fuel Cell Alliance says that they're going to double the number of stations in California by the end of 2019, and we should see another incremental increase in 2020. So the hydrogen stations are definitely coming. There just aren't very many of them at the moment. You could drive this from the Bay Area in California down to Los Angeles or San Diego, and you would stop just like you would for gas. And there are hydrogen stations strategically located in order for that to happen. There's one on I-5 in the middle, and then there's one on 101, so you can choose your path down to Southern California. If you're more of a skier, then you can actually go from the Bay Area in California up to Lake Tahoe, and there is a hydrogen station around Truckee or so. You could even kick it on into Reno and then come back to California without too much of a problem. But there are some areas you just can't go. For instance, you could drive from San Francisco up to Eureka, but you might not be able to get back because there's no hydrogen station up that far. Likewise, if you're in Southern California, you could definitely drive to Vegas and back, but you couldn't go too much further. You couldn't get out to, say, Phoenix and then make a return trip home. So here we are at the gas pump. We basically just insert our card just like regular. This is the fuel filler knob. It looks basically like a gasoline fuel filler knob. Behind this door, we have a little cap that we remove. And then we have our little gas nozzle right there. We simply press it on right like that. It actually is pretty easy. And then we squeeze the trigger that locks it into place. Then if we go back here to the pump, we just pull up on the pump handle just like we used to with gasoline. We press the grade. This vehicle needs 70. And then the filling begins. If you want to stop filling, you don't pull on the trigger over here. You actually just pull this handle right back down on the pump itself, and then the fill will stop. If you want to release the trigger, then there's a release switch right over here. It's basically the same place the unlock switch is on a gasoline pump, and then you pull the handle right off the car. And that's exactly how we fill with hydrogen. I'm only going to put about 2 kilograms in this vehicle because it's going back tomorrow, and they said not to give it a complete fill. Right back there on the dock. Little cap goes back on. And we're done. The Nexo can go 55 to 60 miles on a kilogram of hydrogen. That's how it's going to be sold in the United States. That translates to 57 to 61 mpge. Now, the mpge thing is just as weird when we're talking about a hydrogen vehicle as it is when we're talking about an electric vehicle. But this is supposedly one of the ways that you could compare vehicle to vehicle regardless of what kind of fuel you're feeding it, and get an idea over relative efficiency. So relative efficiency of this is definitely below the relative efficiency of many battery electric vehicles out there. Hydrogen fuel cells have actually made quite a bit of progress in terms of overall efficiency, so this is notably more efficient than some of the earlier fuel cell vehicles that we saw about a decade or so ago. This stores about 6.3 kilograms of hydrogen, or about 14 pounds, in the 3 tanks that are located under the vehicle, giving you between 354 and 380 miles of range. We are driving the model with the lower range. The lower range is caused by these roof rails right up here and the fact that we have wide 245 width tires. If you get the base model, that'll give you 380 miles of range because we have the skinnier tires and no roof rails. That beats the Honda Clarity at 366 miles of range and the Toyota Mirai at just over 310. It also puts this definitely within the same range as the long-range EVs available in America. At the moment, the longest range one is 335 miles. That would be a Tesla Model S, so a little bit below the long-range version of this, or even the model that we're driving right here. But if you want a crossover in this size category, something like a Jaguar I-Pace will only get you 234 miles on a battery. Front seat comfort is quite good and very comparable to something like the Hyundai Santa Fe. We have a 2-way adjustable lumbar support over here for the driver, and it gets pretty aggressive. We don't find any memory seats on here like you might find in a luxury vehicle, but we do have a power seat with a reasonable range of motion. We also have a power passenger seat with about the same range of motion as the driver's seat, but it doesn't have the 2-way lumbar support right there. There's also a tilt telescopic steering column that has a decent range of motion as well. If you get the optional sunroof, which our model has, you do lose about 1 inch of headroom, which is a little bit more than we see in some of the competition. Hopping into the back, we definitely find the advantage of making this a mid-sized crossover rather than something more compact. We get 80.1 inches of combined legroom. That's front row plus second row, which puts this definitely in strong competition in general terms for the mid-sized crossover segment. This is about the same kind of legroom that we'll find in the Chevy Blazer, about 2 inches less than a Santa Fe, but about 2 inches more than we find in the Clarity, or oddly enough, the Tesla Model S. Versus the closest electric competitor at the moment, the Jaguar I-Pace, this is about 4 inches more overall interior room. We also get a significant amount more headroom than most of those other vehicles as well. I have about 1.5 inches sitting back there. You'll really notice that, however, if I move on over to the right side where this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, I still have about 1 inch of legroom left. If you're looking for a green vehicle that you can more easily put child seats, especially rear-facing child seats, this might be a good option. The rear seats feature a fold-down center armrest with a cup holder right there, and then there is actually the ability to recline these seats with this lever over here, or fold them completely forward. There we go. And they do fold completely flat with the cargo area in the back, and we get about 1 inch or so of overall reclinability. Behind the standard power hatch back here, we find 29.6 cubic feet of cargo space. That's nearly 3 times what we find in the Honda Clarity. That's because when Hyundai was designing the fuel cell packaging in this vehicle and the hydrogen tank packaging, they were able to split the hydrogen into 3 separate tanks and then package them underneath the vehicle. That made it overall a lot more compact. Over in the Clarity, we have 1 small tank and then 1 big tank that really takes up a lot of trunk room. That helps this compare relatively well with the competition. It's about the same kind of cargo capacity that we find in the Hyundai Tucson or the Chevy Blazer, and about double what we find in a Tesla Model 3, a little bit more even than we find in a Model S. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top-end limited version, which does get the moonroof. If you don't want the moonroof, then you won't find it in the base blue model. All models have height-adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. The upholstery in all versions of the Nexo is this attractive vegan leatherette, is what they call it. This is actually the most convincing alternative to leather that I've sampled in a vehicle. It actually really does have the feel of leather, and it breathes like leather, which is a nice touch. There are two different color options available in this cabin, the one that we're looking at here, and one that uses navy-colored leatherette seats with some ivory accents. One of the complaints about the Mirai and the Clarity was that the overall interior feel didn't seem to really support its overall price tag, but I think that's different in the Nexo. The overall interior parts quality is actually a little bit more similar to some luxury cars out there. We have a lot of soft touch materials going on the front doors, although we do find some hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door panel. On the passenger side, there's one cup holder that pops out of the dashboard. That's not necessarily my preference. It does seem like those are a little bit easier to damage with people getting in and out of the vehicle. We have soft touch materials on the upper side of the dashboard, some metallic effect trim there, it's not real metal, and then harder plastics at the bottom of the dash. We then have a moderately sized glove compartment that just barely misses that cup holder. I was able to fit an iPad inside. The bulk of the dashboard is dominated by the instrument cluster and infotainment binnacle, which houses this standard large infotainment screen. As you can see, this features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, along with factory navigation that is standard. You can control the system via either the touchscreen or a controller knob that's in the center console. So for instance, we can interact with these hydrogen screens right here without actually touching the screen. This allows you to choose which way you want to interact with the system. We have some pretty basic hydrogen data in here. We have a management system which gives us the status of the tanks, just whether they're okay or whether they're not okay. So hopefully they will all stay okay all the time. This gives you the amount of air purified by the system. Kind of an interesting touch, but hydrogen fuel cell vehicles actually clean the air as it runs through the hydrogen fuel cell stack, so that's what that is telling you right there. And then we have our pretty typical energy flow screen right there. There's also a pretty big range circle right there showing where you could go now that you're completely full of hydrogen. Below the infotainment screen, we have two large air vents, and then we have an absolute ton of buttons. Hyundai seems to have found all the buttons that other companies have excised from their systems and then nestled them right here into this dashboard. We have the controls for that infotainment system up there, some direct access buttons to various features, the buttons for the dual zone climate control, heated and ventilated seats, the driver-only option for that climate control system that helps save power, buttons for the shifter over here, drive, park, neutral, reverse, the buttons and the controller for that infotainment screen if you don't want to touch it, drive mode button, 360-degree camera view, parking sensor button, and then an automated parking system button. Speaking of automated parking, you'll notice that on the key fob right here, we have some interesting buttons. There are these buttons right over here that look like they belong on a minivan, but if you look closer, this is actually car moving forward, car moving backward. That's because this autonomous parking system will not just parallel park the car for you and handle the transmission buttons over here, so it'll actually shift from reverse to drive and then finally park when the operation is complete, but you can actually get out of the car and parallel park the car via the remote control. Let's roll a video of us doing that. Hopping back into the car, I have to say that I'm not quite sure when I would ever use this feature because overall it seemed a lot less convenient than staying in the car and parallel parking it, but hey, it was really cool that it did it. The instrument cluster and infotainment system are basically on the same level. It's a style very similar to what we see in the current generation S-Class. Unlike the S-Class, however, the instrument cluster is a smaller LCD than the infotainment system. So the fuel gauge over here on the right and the temperature gauge over there on the left are not part of the LCD, they're just independent gauges. The instrument cluster itself is not as adaptable as we see in some vehicles out there. It just offers a moderate selection of different screens right there, driver attention warning, status of the vehicle, active safety systems, the hydrogen flow, etc. We then have a digital speedometer on the right with an analog representation right there to the left of that, and then our power and charge gauge on the left along with the range. You can see right now we have a little bit less than half a tank of hydrogen. We still have about 145 miles of driving left. The steering wheel is an attractive two-spoke design. I actually wish that Hyundai would use this steering wheel in other vehicles. We have a thick grip right down there at the bottom that I found actually quite comfortable to use, sport grips up top. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system, along with the button and toggle that change that multifunction LCD right there. We then have the infotainment controls and then phone buttons on the left side of the wheel. On the back of the wheel, there are paddles, but these are not paddle shifters because we have a single speed reduction gear in this vehicle. These are regen paddles. You reduce the regen braking by clicking on the paddle on the right and increase the regen braking by clicking on the paddle on the left. The most important thing to remember about the Nexo is that this really is an electric car. It just so happens to be powered by a different kind of battery. So out on the road, this drives and feels like an electric car. 0 to 60 happens in 8.8 seconds in the model that we're driving here. That may be a little bit shorter in the base version because it is a little bit lighter, but it actually could be a little bit longer as well because it doesn't have tires that are as wide. And we get nearly 300 pound-feet of torque from 0. So this doesn't feel quite as sluggish as that 8.8 seconds would indicate. It actually tends to feel a little bit peppier than that. The wide tires help this model stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 130 feet. That's just a hair longer than the Clarity, but overall pretty good for a larger crossover like this. When it comes to our absolute handling score, the Nexo handles very much like a gasoline crossover because this is overall about that same curb weight, and again we have tires that are relatively comparable as well. So it depends on exactly what you're cross-shopping this with, but if you're cross-shopping this to something like a Santa Fe or a Blazer or an Edge or a Honda Passport, then this is going to be very, very comparable in terms of overall handling ability. But if you're cross-shopping this to something like a Tesla Model 3, Model 3 is going to handle better. Interestingly enough, depending on the surface and exactly how the vehicles are equipped, this may be a little bit better than a Model S, however, because the Model S is significantly heavier. Out on rougher roads like we're on here, the Nexo definitely delivers a polished ride. I think this is a little bit more comfortable than what we see in the Hyundai Santa Fe. This is definitely more tuned to the comfort side of the equation than something like a Chevy Blazer, the Jaguar I-Pace, or something like a Tesla Model 3. I realize those are all kind of random comparisons, but it is a little bit tricky to find something that directly competes to a hydrogen crossover. Back out on the paved road, you'll definitely notice the overall cabin quietness. We came in at 68.5 decibels in this cabin, which puts this second to the Honda Clarity in terms of overall cabin noise, and definitely quieter than the Tesla Model 3. An interesting twist with this fuel cell stack is that it's a lot quieter than what we see in the Honda and definitely quieter than what we see in the Toyota. In the Honda and the Toyota, it sounds kind of like there's a hairdryer going on underneath the hood or underneath a part of the body, but in the Nexo, all those fuel cell noises are definitely muted. Now, when you turn off the car and you get out of the car, you can hear the fuel cell stack drying itself, so there is that hairdryer noise still going on, but inside the cabin, it's very, very hushed. Overall fuel economy is a difficult thing to talk about because, again, overall absolute efficiency is going to be lower in this than something like a battery electric vehicle. But as far as hydrogen fuel cell vehicles go, or gasoline equivalent vehicles, this actually is pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an A- question mark because I'm not really sure how to classify this overall. Over my week with the Nexo, I've been really impressed. This is the kind of vehicle that very easily inserts itself into a gasoline lifestyle. You fill it at the station, you go 380 miles, you don't really have the same kind of range anxiety that you see in a battery electric vehicle. Even though the fuel cell is providing some heat to the cabin, electricity is actually what is providing most of the heat in this cabin in colder weather, but we haven't seen the same kind of range drop that we see in those battery electric vehicles out there. And the modern fuel cell systems are actually designed to cold start down to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit without a problem. So this is finally within a very similar operating range to most gasoline vehicles out there. But then there's also a little bit of blend of electric feel. So the way the vehicle accelerates, the way that it handles out on the road feels a little bit more similar to some battery electric vehicles. We definitely have that low-end punchiness delivered by the electric motor, and then a very quiet and civilized ride that we don't necessarily find in the gasoline competition. Because there's relatively little competition, we're not going to have our usual pricing and comparison section. Instead, let's talk about how much one of these will set you back. The base blue model, $58,300 or $399 a month if you lease it with $2,400 down. If you want the limited trim, which is what we've been driving today, that comes in at $61,800, bumps the lease price up to $449 and the down payment to $3,000, but you still get that gas card and of course the rebates in California. The lease will give you an allowance of 12,000 miles a year, but you also get that $13,000 hydrogen card to help offset the overall fuel costs. So driving one of these could be less expensive than driving the average EV out there with a similar overall lease rate. As with pure EVs, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles qualify for HOV lane access in California and a $5,000 to $7,000 rebate from California as well, depending on your exact financial situation. To help sweeten the deal further and allay fears about what do I do if I want to drive somewhere that doesn't have a hydrogen station, Hyundai will toss in 7 days worth of car rentals a year for 3 years to help you drive out of those range of hydrogen stations. If you've already decided on hydrogen powering your next vehicle, the most direct competitor to the Nexo is the Honda Clarity fuel cell. It's available lease only in California only for $369 a month, plus $2,868 down. Honda goes a little bit further with their lease program, however, than Hyundai does, because they'll give you 20,000 miles a year and $15,000 worth of hydrogen available within that lease for those 3 years. On the flip side, you'll never be able to buy your Clarity because they do want all of them back after that process. No one's exactly clear why with Honda, however. Now, the Nexo is significantly more practical than the Clarity. We have almost 3 times the cargo space, we have more interior room, and the overall interior design, I think, is also fresher, more modern, and definitely more premium feeling. In terms of overall handling ability, the Clarity and the Nexo are actually not too far apart. Depending on exactly how you have them configured, they'll weigh about the same. The Nexo may have a slightly higher center of gravity, but it does have wider tires overall. In this particular comparison, I would definitely get the Nexo, especially if you're interested in purchasing your fuel cell. Speaking of purchasing, the only other fuel cell you can purchase in America is found inside the Toyota Mirai. That model will come in at $58,500, right about the same price as the base Nexo model, or you can lease it for $349 a month at the moment. That lease is relatively similar to what we find in the Nexo. It gives you 12,000 miles a year. They give you a $15,000 fuel card. Pretty much everybody is giving away free hydrogen at this moment. And the Mirai is the only one in this group that is available outside of California at the moment. You can get that in Hawaii as well. On the other hand, in my opinion, the Mirai is the least desirable hydrogen vehicle in this group. It's older than the Clarity, it's older than the Nexo. The range is not nearly as good as we find in this vehicle. This will give you about 70 more miles of overall range. It's not as comfortable as this vehicle, and for some reason it only seats 4 as well, not 5 like we find in the Clarity or the Nexo as well. The big thing about that Mirai, however, is the overall design of the fuel cell and battery systems in that vehicle mean that the seating position is relatively uncomfortable up front because some portions of the drivetrain are actually located under the front row of seats and under the hood, and then of course in the trunk as well. And then they're just the looks. The Nexo is considerably more attractive in my opinion than the Mirai. In my mind, the Nexo serves a different purpose than most electric vehicles in America because of its quick refilling and then of course the range as well. The important thing to remember is that even with a fast recharging electric vehicle, you're not going to get the battery from 0 to completely full in under about an hour. It's just not physically possible at this time. Tesla is getting us as far as we possibly can at the moment. You can get up to about 100 miles of range overall in about 10 or 15 minutes in the latest version of the Model 3. But then if you want to completely fill that battery pack and go 325 miles in your Model 3, that's going to take an awful lot longer. But here in the Nexo, you stop by the hydrogen station, 5 minutes later, you're from 0 to completely full, 350 to 380 miles of range. That means that the overall experience in driving this vehicle is very, very similar to driving a gasoline vehicle. So if that's the kind of experience you're after, that's what you're going to find in the Nexo. If, on the other hand, you don't like gas stations and you never want to see one again, you're going to have to be stopping in a Nexo at those stations, and you wouldn't in your battery electric vehicle. You plug it in at home, you plug it in at work, you're never going to have to stop at a gas station. For some people, that is the ultimate inconvenience, whereas for some people, being able to fill the vehicle quickly is the ultimate convenience. I'll finish this video by saying that the Nexo is actually on my short list for replacing my 2016 Kia Soul EV. I haven't made any firm decisions yet, but I happen to be in the window where hydrogen stations located in the Bay Area are actually very convenient for me personally, so this wouldn't be too much of a lifestyle change moving from a gasoline vehicle or an electric vehicle over into the Nexo, and I really love the overall range in this vehicle. So with all that out of the way, let me know what you think about the Nexo and what you would pick if you were shopping down there in the comment section below. Hyundai tells us that they do plan on bringing a lot more of these to the market in the US and worldwide because South Korea has a really big push for hydrogen vehicles soon. They really want about 500,000 of them out there by 2030. Well, that may not be a lot for America. That's definitely a huge number of hydrogen cars for a country like South Korea. Again, let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexNatos, and I'll see you next week.